I warmly welcome you here to Tiki, your podcast for consciousness, health, and happiness. My name is Sandra, and today I've chosen a topic that takes up so much space in everyone's life, whether they live it or not, and one that is talked about so much, yet at the same time is often the least understood, and that is sexuality. This podcast is called Sexuality Return to Aliveness, and in what follows, I want to explain a great deal to you about why sexual energy is so much more than sexuality, what is to be understood by suppression and also consumption, and that these are actually two sides of the same misunderstanding. We will look at the body, the nervous system and energy system, and also at pornography, stimulation, and alienation. So we will also look at many blockages that often stand in the way of physical sexuality and then suppress aliveness. Conscious sexuality is much more than what most people understand about it, and surrender is the end of control. Therefore, I wish you a lot of joy with what follows, and that you can really listen with an open heart, less head, more heart. That is always the best way to truly receive the spoken word. Yes, so sexuality. For centuries, it has either been suppressed or idealized in some form, as it is today, for example. Back then, it was declared a sin, made into a problem, hidden away, and burdened with shame. This shame, many of us still feel it today, yes, distorted further and further through the ancestral line or through other incarnations. And today, we seem to encounter something sexual everywhere. In movies, in advertising, on social media, on the internet, and of course in our private encounters as well. And yet so many people feel totally disoriented, disconnected from one another, or even unfulfilled inside, especially in this area. And since it is still such a, taboo subject, many people don't even get to the core of what it's really about. And it is certainly also because we mostly only talk about sex, but hardly about the power from which sexuality arises in the first place. When we hear the word sexual energy, most people immediately think of sex, that is, physical pleasure. But sexual energy is much more comprehensive. It is a primal life force, a creative power, and from my perspective, one of the most important forms of our vitality, of our life force. And that is exactly what today is about. It's not about judging sexuality or declaring any specific form or technique of it as the right one. I'm also not going to tell you how much or how little is right or wrong. Rather, we are looking at what this energy means in our entire life, why it can be blocked, and why such a completely natural sexuality, which is truly joyful in all possible areas of life, yes, why it doesn't begin in the bedroom, but in the way we live. And perhaps this will also change your perspective on your sexuality or on sexuality in general. But perhaps you will also recognize something that seemingly has nothing to do with sexuality, but rather much more about creativity, about your relationships, about your aura, your charisma, and about how alive you actually really feel at the moment. Let's start at the core. Physical sexuality and sexual energy are not the same thing. They belong together, but they are not identical. Perhaps a simple image helps. Solar heat is an effect of the sun, but it is not the sun itself. And in the same way, physical sexuality is a form of expression of sexual energy, but not its entire meaning. Sexual energy is the force behind it, which is the engine from which new life can biologically emerge. But if this immense power can bring forth new life, that is, new human beings, then it would be truly illogical to limit it exclusively to reproduction or physical pleasure, because the same inner movement shows itself everywhere where something wants to come into being, where something wants to grow, where something wants to unfold, where you want to create or manifest something from your innermost motivation. And perhaps you know this, You are working on some idea and then you completely lose track of time. You are designing a room, or you are writing something, or you are painting or making music or developing some project, and suddenly you feel this intensity that carries you from within. You forget everything around you. You don't need to eat anymore. Yeah, time flies by and you are focused, you are awake and full of energy. And that is this intrinsic motivation, and that is your creative power. Or another example, you fall in love and suddenly you have many more ideas, your perception becomes sharper, you radiate much more, and your whole life seems more colorful and lighter to you. The energy is not only active in the physical realm, it permeates your thinking, your feelings, your creativity, and your entire aura, your whole impact. Yes, and charisma is radiance, and this radiance can change significantly when a person does not constantly hold back their vitality. We can sense whether someone is present on the inside or if they are just animating some shell. And a person with charisma, with true vitality, doesn't have to be loud at all, nor do they need to convince or impress anyone. Their energy is simply present. And that is why I would describe sexual energy as a fundamental energy, as our inner engine, our intensity, our ability to focus on something and then give it power. Sexual energy or charisma can be lived physically, but it can just as easily flow into a work, a relationship, a healing process, or a new phase of life. And that also explains why sexuality cannot be viewed separately from other areas of life. So let's take career, creativity, relationships, sexuality. Everything draws on the same vitality. So if a great deal of energy is permanently tied up in performance and control and responsibility, and what else do I have to do and by when, then it is often missing elsewhere. And you might know this too, that you have times when you have a lot of projects or where you simply work under high pressure for weeks. You function, you organize, you get things done. And in the evening, well, you might wonder, or maybe not, why you have no desire for intimacy. And many then think that something is wrong with their sexuality. But perhaps this sexual energy has simply flowed into all those projects. It only knew one direction, namely performance. And then if you know that, then you probably also know the other story, namely that after a few days of vacation, often not only does relaxation set in, but people become more curious, more playful, more open again. At the beginning, you might just want to, lie around on the beach, or many people get sick at first, because they had just been pushing themselves for performance for so long and can finally let go. But then after a few days, that childlike side usually starts to come out. Yes, what else is there to discover here? Where can we go? What kind of excursions can we take? Depending on what kind of vacationer you are, yes, please just adapt that to your own life now. But what often goes along with that when you sort of reawaken internally is the need for closeness. That can return as well. Not because the vacation fixes your sexuality, but because space has been created again for this natural flow of energy. So this first important realization is therefore, sexuality is not an isolated area of life that takes place in the bedroom, but rather it is an expression of our entire vitality. And when a force is not properly understood, people generally react in one of two ways. Either they suppress it entirely or they act it out intensely. So in that way, I keep reenacting it all the time and constantly keep it before my eyes. With sexuality, we see both of these very clearly. On one hand, there are these religious and societal notions of guilt and shame, through which we really, humanity, have been oppressed for centuries, because desire was viewed as evil, as a danger. Sexual desires had to be hidden somehow. Women in particular were often devalued for expressing their sexual energy. And at this point, I would also like to recommend my 2 podcasts on darkness, which go even deeper into the topic of what that has done to us and how we can reconcile ourselves with this darkness, which is also the feminine energy. But this podcast is for both men and women. So let's stay completely neutral there. Suppression never makes an energy disappear. You just push it out of your consciousness, and then it can, it mutates, so to speak, somewhere in your shadow, and can then show itself with other faces, for example, with guilt and shame, fear, compulsion. You create a double life in order to be able to live out one side, and on the other side to be the loving man, the loving woman. Also aggression, inner division, all of that can simply manifest itself through this suppression. And we must also clearly state that the numerous scandals within strict sex-negative systems, religious ones of course, clearly show that prohibitions alone do not produce a mature way of dealing with such a powerful life force. And the other extreme to suppression is consumption. Sexuality is seemingly liberated today, but often only from old morality, not from unconsciousness. And that is a big difference. We see sexuality and nudity everywhere. It is truly staged, evaluated, compared, and even turned into a performance. And our body, it reacts. It is supposed to react. It is supposed to function and, yes, somehow correspond to one of these images that are being presented. Suppression and this uninhibited consumption seem like opposites, but both reduce sexuality to a physical drive. And in that way, they are somewhat the same, because both separate it from the heart, from consciousness, and also from responsibility. And perhaps you know this from relationships. In the beginning, 2 people are curious about each other. They perceive each other, they discover each other, they react to the moment because they are completely present. When does the other person smile? What do they like? How do they react? And so on. And over time, yes, an increasingly rigid pattern emerges. You think you know what the other person likes, how an encounter goes, and what is expected. And especially with physical sexuality, it then becomes mechanical. You go through the motions of something that was once alive, but is now no longer checked for its relevance. But people have changed. We are constantly changing. The body has changed. The relationship has changed. Our needs, our vibration, everything changes. How then can a sexual encounter still be alive within an old pattern? It can't. And that explains why people sometimes say they have lost interest in sexuality over the course of their lives. Of course, hormones also play a role, health, life circumstances, and so on. That's clear. But often it's not that sexual energy has disappeared, but rather that the previous form of expression no longer fits. We are not the same people at 50 as we were at 20. Our needs, our pace, our sensitivity, and our way of expressing closeness, of dancing with closeness, it keeps changing again and again. Everything that is alive must constantly change. And if sexuality is to remain alive, then it must be allowed to evolve with us. Aliveness never comes from repetition, but from presence. And that doesn't mean you should constantly be trying something new. That would be the distortion again, yes, geared towards performance, but rather it means not categorizing the other person, or even yourself, as I already know this. An honest question can be more alive than any technique. How am I doing today? What am I feeling? What do I need? What feels right and what doesn't? Where we believe we already know everything, we stop perceiving within ourselves and, of course, with others as well. And that is where a relationship starts to function rather than flow. And I would like to take a look with you now at the body, the nervous system, and the energy system to delve a little deeper into that and perhaps take away one or two insights. Why does such a physical encounter sometimes feel deep and, yes, so nourishing and connecting and strengthening, and other times empty and exhausting? Externally, the process might be similar, but internally, completely different processes are taking place, and we are operating on completely different frequencies. Our body doesn't just react to touch, it also reacts to our feelings and the signals we send it. Do I feel safe? How attentive am I right now, or is the other person right now? What is my inner attitude toward this encounter right now? A nervous system that feels safe can open up, and a nervous system that perceives pressure, judgment, or insecurity, well, it stays a bit on high alert, it remains vigilant. Even if the mind says, hey, everything is fine, you know this person, or whatever, but our nervous system has its own mechanism for that. And perhaps you know this just as an example. A small, honest hug can touch you more deeply than an intense physical encounter. And the difference lies then not in the strength of the stimulus, but in the quality of the connection. I once, just as a small example, many years ago when I got my cat as a baby, I was reading about cats and there was a sentence in it that I have never forgotten. Namely, that the cat senses exactly whether I am just petting her in passing or whether I am truly present with her. And from then on, I always observed that, and it was absolutely true. As soon as I just thought, oh, I'll quickly go down on my knees and pet her because I haven't petted her much today, the energy and reaction from her side was completely different than when I was genuinely happy that she was there and really, just welcomed her. Even though the hand might be making the same movement, there is an energy that comes with it that living beings can sense. And we humans, we are at least as sensitive as animals. We have just learned to often put our intellect in front of it. We have built layers of trauma around our feelings and so on. But this energy of motivation, it still gets through. And that is why I want to say, deep intimacy does not begin with arousal, but with trust. And that doesn't mean at all that arousal shouldn't be there, or that there's anything wrong with it. Not at all. But the quality of the encounter, if it is only based on arousal, then it has a much lower quality than if it happens differently. And yes, in spiritual traditions and also naturally in Tiki, the chakras are additionally used. There are different levels described on which our vitality expresses itself. Development practically begins down in the root chakra. That is logical. A tree needs roots first, a child needs care, protection, and the feeling of being welcome first. And the fundamental questions of the first chakra are always, am I safe? Am I allowed to be here? Am I welcome? Is life for me? Can I trust? And if this foundation is missing, then a part of the system remains on high alert. Letting go then becomes difficult. Surrender becomes difficult. Closeness, might be desired, but at the same time experienced somewhere as a danger from which one must protect oneself to some extent. And when control replaces trust, then I probably don't need to explain anymore how blocked sexual encounters can be as a result. And the second chakra stands, among other things, for relationships, exchange, creativity, sexuality, and reproduction, as well as for the manifestation of your projects. And these topics, they belong together because they all have to do with creation. I enter into a relationship with a person, an idea, or a task, and from this exchange, something emerges. We create something. And that's why, yes, these areas of life can strengthen each other, but they can also drain energy from one another. Whoever binds all their strength into work, success, and responsibility often has little free energy or attention left for physical intimacy. And conversely, of course, a permanently compensatory sexuality can bind the energy that would actually be needed for creativity, clarity, or professional development. It's not about a fixed amount and it's not about moral rules either. It's about balance and the question of whether energy is being directed consciously or whether it is controlling us unconsciously. And everyone has their own feeling for that and their own way of managing it. In an encounter that is simply aimed at quick arousal, the energy is just stoked very strongly and focused on a discharge, and then the tension drops. That can be pleasant because the pressure has been released, but some people feel, strangely empty, tired, distant afterwards, and usually have no desire for closeness or cuddling anymore. And it is completely different with a conscious and loving encounter, because the energy is distributed quite differently from the very beginning. It is not just aimed at a short, quick climax, but is allowed to create the whole body, the whole being. And yes, this emotional closeness nourishes this entire process. So people then tend to report this sense of connection, this deep inner satisfaction, and warmth even after the orgasm. And that is the big difference, which is how we also notice on what level we were playing. From a spiritual perspective, one could say that the energy does not just rise up and leave the system, but is reintegrated through the heart and consciousness. And from the perspective of the nervous system, we could say the body experiences arousal within safety and connection. And both models describe the same experience in different ways. And now let's get to pornography, stimulation, and alienation. And this is really not about morality, please. So no one here is sitting with a wagging finger. It's simply about the energetic effect. And I would like to make that conscious because I see how much unconsciousness there still is among people. So our nervous system learns through repetition. That means if arousal is regularly associated with constantly changing, intense images, with rapid escalation and immediate reward, then the system adapts to that and it learns more and more to react to intense external stimuli. It's like when you eat too much sugar, right? Anyone who constantly needs sugar will eventually barely perceive the subtle sweetness of a strawberry. And that doesn't mean the strawberry doesn't taste good or lack sweetness, but rather that your perception has been tuned to stronger stimuli, or like eating spicy food, whatever. And it can be similar in sexuality, where real intimacy, it's much slower. It's more unpredictable and, of course, much more vulnerable. Yeah. And it demands attention for another person, real presence, whereas pornographic images are available at any time. And we can then control them and even practically tailor and control the stimulation to them. And because of that, arousal can naturally detach itself from relationships, and some people are even fine with that. Yes, sometimes it's a defense mechanism. The body learns images instead of intimacy, learns dopamine spikes instead of devotion, and learns performance instead of presence. And some people then experience less sensitivity, perhaps have difficulty truly allowing intimacy, feel ashamed after orgasm, or feel somehow internally detached. That doesn't mean that every instance of consumption has the same effect or that people should be judged, for heaven's sake. What's crucial is the honest observation. Does this behavior make me more alive and capable of connection, or duller, more restless, and above all, more dependent? Anyone who realizes that they actually need porn or thoughts, pornographic thoughts and images, to even reach orgasm has fallen into a dependency. And, of course, a large part of the porn industry is also linked to exploitation, boundary violations, and staged violence. And that means anyone who consumes such images doesn't always see what's behind them. You might only see the finished piece that is then presented to you, but how it came to be and how the people involved were doing and so on, whether it doesn't matter. You don't see that, but you feel it. And such a nervous system is capable of learning. So, as soon as such a cycle has been interrupted, as soon as it has been recognized, it can be interrupted. That's what I mean to say. Sensitivity can return bit by bit if strong stimuli are reduced and genuine perception is practiced again. So less sugar and you can taste the strawberry again. Less Tabasco and you can notice the pepper again. You can feel your own body again. You can also endure boredom for a change. You can allow closeness, slow down, and not always have to bring excitement to the max. Desire is not the enemy here. Desire should be the compass, and that is important, yes. No one is denying your arousal and your desire here. But what is the motivation behind it? If desire is your compass, then it can show you that energy is present. And the question is not whether we are allowed to have desire, but where this desire wants to lead us right now. Does it lead to more presence, more connection, more authenticity? Wonderful. Go for it. But if it serves to avoid having to feel something, to numb yourself, to release pressure, to get rid of pain, emptiness, or tension, then you might be better off finding something else. Sexuality should not be a substitute for a lack of vitality. But it can truly be a celebration of vitality if you let it flow. Yes, and when people experience difficulties with sexuality, they often seek, counseling that focuses purely on the physical realm, so it must have something to do with the body. But and then hormones come into play and so on. But sexuality is only an expression and not the cause. We already covered that. This means it is simply an area where suppressed, unresolved issues become visible. You want closeness and withdraw as soon as it arises. Do you know that feeling? Or you wish you could truly let go, but you are constantly observing yourself, controlling yourself. Maybe you compare your body, or you try to fulfill expectations, or you are afraid of not being enough. And behind all these reactions are some kind of traumas or some kind of beliefs that sex is dirty, or that your desires are not right, or that you are not beautiful enough, or that your desire is not strong enough, or too strong, or that you are not allowed to show yourself, or that you have to please the other person, and so on. And all of this doesn't just affect your mind, it shapes your posture, your breathing, your perception, and your nervous system. Shame makes us tight. Fear makes us tight. Performance pressure prevents us from feeling, keeps us in our heads. And of course, distressing experiences can also be stored very deeply. So, traumas from violence, from boundary violations, from rejection, shame, fear of pregnancy, abortion, painful relationships, or simply the feeling of having been sexually used. And such experiences cannot simply be resolved by the intention to be a little more relaxed. Rather, it just requires the appropriate tool. So for one thing, really taking a look, you don't have to force yourself through the blockage. A no from your body is not a malfunction that needs to be overcome, but rather it is usually a protective mechanism that wants to be understood. And when you look at that and understand what it's connected to, regardless of whether it was one of your own experiences, whether it comes from an ancestral pattern, or whether it was other experiences of the soul, the crucial thing is that we can consciously perceive it and then consciously transform it, meaning release it from our energy system, from our nervous system. It then no longer has any foundation. You can simply ask yourself, if you feel like it, how do I think about my body, my desire? How do I think about sexuality in general, or even my own? If I really want to show myself, what gets in my way? Where do I become constricted? Where am I still pretending? Even faking it during sex sometimes seems harmless, like pretending you're enjoying it a lot or that you're having an orgasm or whatever. Maybe we just don't want to disappoint our partner, but the body cannot be deceived. Your whole system then rebels against itself, do you understand? Your body is experiencing something completely different from what you are pretending, that is, from what you are expressing. And it is an inner split that you are causing with that, which in turn simply reinforces over time the alienation from yourself, but also from your partner. Honesty does not mean speaking every thought unfiltered, but it also means not staging a reality that isn't actually there. If you simply give an honest, "I need some time right now," that can be more intimate than any acted-out performance. The moment we stop acting, real connection can take place. And that doesn't just apply in bed. Anyone who is constantly playing some role in everyday life will naturally play it in bed too. Authentic sexuality therefore begins with an authentic life. And very importantly, conscious sexuality is far removed from any technique. What can two people concretely do if they want to experience sexuality more consciously? They can become more honest, more authentic. Before their bodies touch, the people must truly encounter one another. See each other. Are we really here? What is bringing us together right now? There is no wrong answer. We don't have to judge it, but if we understand that it makes a difference whether we are currently drawn to each other through love and closeness, or whether we need comfort or want to release pressure onto the other person, then we are a huge step further. Perhaps it also helps to look at each other for a moment before such an encounter, to breathe together, to give the nervous system time to adjust to one another. Not as a rigid ritual, but simply as an interruption of the usual routine. What would we like to experience or open up to with each other today? What needs safety? What pace, what vibration is right for us today? It doesn't mean becoming particularly serious or solemn. That's not how I want to portray it, yeah? It can be light, it can be wild, it can come together with laughter, with hesitation, with tears, with everything possible. Presence is not perfection, and your body is not a tool that just has to function somehow. Rather, your body is the place where your soul and your consciousness have experiences. And you cannot just use it. If you do that, then you lose contact with its wisdom. But if you really listen to your body, then it shows you exactly what is right. And the orgasm, it is not a proof of quality. So if it happens, then it happens, and if it doesn't happen, then this encounter has not failed. It should not be devalued. Let go of the pressure to have to reach some goal. Conscious sexuality does not necessarily end with the climax. And above all, it doesn't end afterwards. Afterwards, the integration begins. So even there, that difference I mentioned earlier, whether I want closeness afterwards or not, tells us a very interesting story. And yes, one more thing is important. Conscious sexuality is not tied to a specific age. The form of expression may change. Perhaps it becomes slower, more subtle, less frequent, or even more intimate. Perhaps it partially fades into the background, but that does not mean that the sexual energy has disappeared. Aliveness can manifest in so many ways of expression. Touch, tenderness, creativity, humor, intellectual closeness, or even shared silence. The crucial thing is that we don't need a fixed form, but that it is allowed to flow, that we are authentic. And sexuality should not be repeated, but rather it should be discovered again and again, And with that, we perhaps come to the most important point of surrender. Surrender is often understood in such a romantic and passive way, but surrender does not mean giving up boundaries or somehow delivering yourself to another person. It means releasing the inner resistance against what we are truly feeling and letting ourselves fall into it. You know, this control, it always wants to create security, plan, evaluate, force results. That may be necessary in everyday life sometimes, but you cannot control aliveness. You kill it through control. Perhaps you know this. The harder you try to fall asleep, the more awake you become. And the more you try to stay awake, the tireder you become. The more you try to be spontaneous, the more artificial it feels. And the more you desperately want to let go during a sexual encounter, the more you end up observing yourself again. Surrender cannot be forced. It is not something we do. Rather, surrender arises when the very compulsion to have to do something subsides. And for that, trust is needed, which is why this whole long podcast exists, because everything builds upon one another. Trust in your own body, in your own boundaries, in your own perception, and also in the mindfulness of your partner. Surrender does not begin with the command to let go, but rather it begins with safety, honesty, and clear yeses and nos. And then, aliveness can move again and express itself exactly as it is right now. And perhaps there is tenderness, perhaps there is sadness, perhaps there is pleasure, perhaps there is deep desire, perhaps, whatever it may be. That is exactly where the return to naturalness lies. Naturalness does not mean following every impulse immediately, but rather perceiving the impulse, taking responsibility, and consciously deciding which form is appropriate right now. And when sexual energy is allowed to flow freely again, it doesn't just show itself in physical sexuality. It becomes a creative flow of zest for life, courage, charisma, strength, and the ability to truly engage. And perhaps that's why we really make a mistake when we try to improve sexuality. Perhaps sexuality wants to show us much more where we are still controlling and holding ourselves back, and not trusting our own vitality. Instead of thinking, how can I become a better lover? You can think, how can I become a more vibrant person? Where our vitality is allowed to flow, many things change all by themselves. Our relationships, our creativity, and also our sexuality, our charisma. Not because we have perfected them, but because we are encountering ourselves again. And that is why, even though the title says sexuality, this podcast was about much, much more. It was about the power that lets us feel, create, love, and grow. About this power, which is by no means sinful and by no means arbitrary, but rather requires responsibility and awareness. Sexual energy is not something we create, but rather it is always there. And we also experience it as desire, as intensity, as creative power, longing, or sometimes even as restlessness. The question is not whether it flows, but where it flows and what it creates there. Perhaps the return to vitality does not begin with a major change, but with an honest look at yourself. Where am I holding myself back? Where am I playing a role? Where am I just functioning? And where does something inside me want to come alive again? Sexuality can remind us of these questions, and not because it is the answer to everything, but because it, yes, simply shows us very clearly how we deal with intimacy, trust, truth, and vitality. And that is perhaps its deeper meaning, not to lead us away from life somehow, but rather to bring us back into the heart of life, fully and completely. And so I will wrap things up once again with a short poem and a little bit of text. I truly wish you the most wonderful and insightful experiences as you explore this new playing field that you may have just opened up for yourself through listening to this podcast. The field is wide open now, and you can finally decide for yourself to truly let those vibrant energies back into your life, the ones that make you feel deeply alive. It is time to consciously choose to release and let go of everything that has been holding you back. Within you lies a power that needs no name. It was already there before you learned to hold yourself back. It lives in your joy, in your longing, in your yes to life, in your love. It paints pictures, writes texts, seeks closeness, opens the voice, and reminds your body to be alive. You are allowed to listen to it, to this power, to invite it to flow in your life again. Aliveness is not a goal that is waiting for you somewhere. Aliveness flows where you stop hiding yourself. And when you show yourself again to yourself and others, then pure life happens through you once more.